Good evening. I'm Dina Lowy, Chair of the History Department at Gettysburg College. On behalf of the Robert Fortenbaugh family, the Civil War Institute, and my colleagues in the History Department, I'd like to welcome you all to the 63rd Annual Robert Fortenbaugh Memorial Lecture. The goal of the lecture is to honor the memory and spirit of Lincoln's visit to Gettysburg. We also continue to honor the memory of our dear colleague Pete Carmichael, who delighted in exactly what the Fortenbaugh Lecture offers: thoughtful conversations about Civil War history that bring together participants from varied backgrounds. Tonight, we bring you the past, present, and future of the Civil War, a conversation. We're honored to welcome 3 award-winning historians whose research and teaching have fundamentally reshaped our understanding of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the long struggle over slavery and its legacies. David W. Blight, Sterling Professor of History at Yale University, most recently author of Yale and Slavery, A History, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. Drew Gilpin Faust, President Emerita, and Arthur Kingsley Porter University Professor of History at Harvard University, author of the landmark This Republic of Suffering, Death and the American Civil War, as well as her recent memoir, Necessary Trouble, Growing Up at Mid-Century. And Stephanie McCurry, R. Gordon Hoxie Professor of American History at Columbia University, author of Women's War, Fighting and Surviving the American Civil War, and the influential Confederate Reckoning, Power and Politics in Civil War South. I could easily spend the better part of our session tracing the extraordinary scope of the impact of these 3 scholars, but in order to reserve as much time as possible for their conversation, I offer this abbreviated introduction and turn you over to my colleagues, Jim Downs and Scott Hancock, who will moderate tonight's discussion.
So first, thank you so much for coming. Tonight we're thrilled to present this as a roundtable discussion in order to maximize hearing the opinions and ideas of these 3 brilliant scholars. So I circulated questions in advance, so I'm going to read them, and we hope that it will be an impromptu, fun, and inspiring conversation. So the first, Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. Because the Fortenbaugh Symposium takes place on the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, it feels fitting to pause and reflect on that moment. The address is one of the most studied speeches in American history. Yet it's also easy to forget how radical it may have sounded in 1863. When you think about it as a piece of wartime rhetoric, as a political and moral argument delivered in the midst of a national crisis, what strikes you most about it today? How do you understand what Lincoln was trying to accomplish in that moment? Over the course of your careers, have your views of Lincoln and of the address itself evolved? Do you see it as a turning point in how Americans understood the war's purpose? And if so, what kind of turning point? Political, moral, or something else? We'll start with Drew Faust.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for inviting us. I'm at work now on a book about American speeches, so I've been thinking a lot about rhetoric and its role in American life, and that, of course, continually brings me back to the Gettysburg Address. I think, in a way, every great American speech that followed the Gettysburg Address has tried to be the Gettysburg Address. It's shaped our history ever since. And the brilliant thing in my mind about it, one thing Jim asked in correspondence with us is, what part of it, what words do you like the best? And so I thought hard about that, and I think the words that mean the most to me are "shall not have died in vain," because it captures such an important part of the address. It's so brilliant in the way Lincoln starts with history, 7, he ends with the future, new birth of freedom. He starts with death, he ends with the immortality of these people who have died, and also the immortality of the nation that must live. Neither will perish. He moves them from death to life. And he also moves his listeners from being listeners to being actors. They start off hearing what he's saying to them, they're an audience, but he ends with a call to action that it's up to them. They must be dedicated to make sure these men don't die in vain. And so the new birth of freedom that is the future takes its life out of the structure of that speech as well as out of the words of the speech. And so we have people, I mean, the Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream speech starts with the words or models itself on the Gettysburg Address. This idea of a new birth of freedom has continued to inspire American rhetoric as the kind of pinnacle of what our nation ought to be and what rhetoric will be for it in making it happen. And so that's kind of my basis for my complete devotion, dedication to the dedication of the Gettysburg Address.
That's beautiful, Drew. Yeah, lest we forget, the opening refrain in Martin Luther King's dream speech is not about a dream, it's 100 years later, 100 years later. In rereading it again, what I came to think about was that he never names himself. I love that. He never uses the I pronoun. He uses we and our, I think it's 12 times. We as the nation, which gets named 3 or 4 times, but he's not there. I mean, I'm partly thinking about that in our contemporary terms, but only partly. I mean,
Unnecessary.
I mean, humility may not be in now, but Lincoln couldn't help it. But it's not about him. He never uses I. It's about us and the people, of the people, by the people, for the people, by the people. I have some other favorite words in there, but my favorite word may be the one that's not there. I. It's not about him.
The one thing that I would add, and listening to Drew now makes me realize why I like these words. I can't, when I teach the Gettysburg Address every year, it's so short you can read it in a lecture course. They don't even have to read it in advance. And every time I start reading it, I realize why I shouldn't do this, because I choke up every time. It's incredibly moving, and to me, the words that stand out to me are this nation or any nation so conceived. It's the universality of the claim in the midst of this bloody national struggle. I'm Irish, not American. My received history of the United States was things like that, the Declaration of Independence. Slavery was a terrible shock to me when I found out that it actually happened by the same person who wrote the Declaration of Independence. And so the Lincoln that is in this speech, the thing that's so astonishing to me is I always think about this pamphlet that was written during the war in 1863, George Steele. It's called How a Free People Conduct a Long War. And you know, he is trying, in the midst of the carnage, he's naming the principle. He's cogent enough to name the principle that could possibly maybe make this worthy. And we're the ones who have to be worthy. Like Drew said, it's about the future. But that's really an astonishing thing, the way he can rise above, in so few words, rise above the particularity to make this case. And it rings as so authentic, because anybody who knows anything about Lincoln knows that the foundational document for him is the Declaration of Independence. And so that's where he always goes back to, and that's at the core of this too. So now I realize, like, the specific words that speak to me are the ones of the person outside the United States who reads that and says, this was the defense of democracy, of government by the people, for the people, in the midst of the worst kind of trial it could possibly be subjected to. And that's a kind of leadership that is just, you know, I don't know, kind of incredible, unthinkable in many ways.
So let's think about it also in the context of the war itself, and how can you talk about it as a reflection of a turning point within the war? And also, is there a way of talking about it in conversation with the Emancipation Proclamation?
Which had already happened
Right.
before.
Me first.
Go ahead.
Well,
We got a little order going here, I guess.
For the moment.
Go ahead.
okay. I think the new birth of freedom idea does, as Stephanie says, give a meaning to what has been a kind of uncertain direction that the Union has taken. Finally, the Emancipation Proclamation has happened. The war is about slavery as a defined purpose, which it wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation. And now there's been this terrible battle that has sort of sealed that purpose in blood. And yet there's an awful lot more of the war to go. And as many people die after Gettysburg as have died before Gettysburg in this war. So there is a great deal of suffering still to be engaged in, and a lot of military confrontation and hardship. And so I think it's a turning point in that it directs, as I said earlier, towards the future and towards that compulsion, that energizing with a purposeful. People come to the Gettysburg Address maybe without a purpose. They leave having heard it with a purpose. And that seems to me the most important turning point. Obviously, it's often said that Gettysburg is the military turning point of the war. But I think in your initial question, Jim, you said, is it a moral and ideological turning point? Absolutely.
Right.
Well, we're going to agree probably too much here tonight, but I agree with that entirely. To me, the Gettysburg Address is also, as well as some other speeches and documents of Lincoln's and others, is a recognition that the United States is being destroyed and has to be remade. Rebirth, perhaps the central metaphor of the whole thing. It's got to be remade. It's being destroyed. And some of you may know the cemetery was by no means finished. Some of the graves were still open. You could see the coffins. It's very unfinished. And the word unfinished is also in that. Frederick Douglass took a speech on the road right after this. I always wanted to find some document where he had read the Gettysburg Address and, was modeling it or something. I never quite found the smoking letter, but he took a speech on the road in late November, all over the North for the next many months, called Mission of the War. It's not short, typical of Douglass. It was about an hour and a half long, but the argument's the same. He says what the Civil War is becoming is national regeneration, and that becomes a refrain for him. He uses that over and over. It's national, it's being remade in blood, and therefore it has to be prosecuted to whatever horrific end it takes. That's there in the Gettysburg Address. That the Republic is being destroyed and remade, which is not always the way Americans at least grow up wanting to think about the Civil War. That it was our destruction before it became any kind of remaking.
The other thing I would say when I think about the Lincoln and that moment when he wrote and delivered the Gettysburg Address is how far he had come. I mean, one of the questions Jim asked us was, have our views of Lincoln changed over the course of our own teaching careers? And in many ways mine has, because I'm not a person who needs historical heroes. I write about reactionaries. So I don't write about the people who I think I like. I write about people who exercise power in ways that I think it's important to contend with. So it's not that I'm a person who needs heroes. I don't. But Lincoln is, my appreciation for what he did there has to do with how far he had come, his own journey, and my appreciation of his ability to see with this clarity is because he battled his way to that. I mean, he's easily indicted for some of the positions that he had taken prior to this position, colonization and others. And yet here he's committing himself to this vision too, it seems to me, and he has come to this position, and he has brought the country with him. That's why I think of the Stele speech. You know, you have to bring the nation with you. If you're going to ask for this kind of sacrifice, how do you bring the public with you? And he's the journey of the nation in that sense. And this is his commitment to emancipation and the mission of emancipation and the new birth of freedom. And the other thing is knowing him heading forward. Once black soldiers serve, first of all, Lincoln's commitment to the dignity of labor, I think, is one fundamental strain of what gets him to emancipation. But then once black soldiers serve, he can never, I think, surrender his obligation to their service. And I think that's what we're also seeing at Gettysburg, is he's a changed man, I think, by the time he writes this speech. And so it's not that he's always right. That's not what I appreciate about him. It's that he learned and grew in that role. And I think the Gettysburg Address is his mature statement of why emancipation is the right, was the right policy, why it has to be the future.
So what does the Gettysburg Address mean to black people at the time? I mean, both in terms of thinking about it in what Drew said, this idea of thinking about the Gettysburg Address in terms of the future, in terms of what David said, in terms of destroying and remaking, thinking about it in terms of just what is the day-to-day reality? I mean, is this something that you've seen in either some of the sources or in some of the literature? How has that been understood?
Before
Yeah.
you answer,
Yeah.
because I think one small hint of that, and it's a question that was one of the things you said, Dave, when Lincoln doesn't say I. My question for you is going to be, so, not that you can, I'm not asking you to improve on the Gettysburg Address, but are there things that you might think are missing or that don't get attention? Because the Christian Recorder, which is a black newspaper in Philadelphia at the time, they had a reporter here, and either consciously or unconsciously, probably male, so I'm going to say he, when he reported back to the Christian Reporter, because as you all probably know, there are different versions of the Gettysburg Address, a preposition here or there changes. So he recorded the last line as, of the people, by the people, for all the people. He stuck it all in there, and I don't know if he did it intentionally or if that's what he thought he heard. So I think you get a little hint of that.
That's interesting.
That's fascinating.
But yeah, so he thought there was something missing in there, consciously or unconsciously.
Well, back in the first sentence, where he mouths the word equal, I mean, you could stop there and say, oh, come on, draw that out a bit. Come on, Mr. President. Dedicated to the proposition all men are born equal. Or do you say created? Born. Created, thank you. So sure, we could go line by line and rewrite. But I'd never heard that a reporter.
I'll send you the article.
Good, I'd love to see that. Because that's a good teaching thing. I could, next time I recite, I might put that in there and say, what does this change?
Yeah, well, and back to Jim's question, I think so we have this one hint of how one black reporter may have thought about what it potentially meant or could mean. So now you would respond to the rest of what Jim's posing.
There was a lot of black comment in the press and otherwise about the second inaugural. I guess that may have been more available and spread more widely than the Gettysburg Address, at least initially.
I think one of the things we've learned in recent years is it's not clear that he would have even been able to articulate those words without the pressure of a black abolitionist movement pressing those ideas, what some legal historians call like a popular constitutionalism, like creating the space and the meaning of those words. And you can say all men are created equal. Well, from the time it was written, by Jefferson to the time it was used by Lincoln till after, the fight is over what that means. So those words have to be imbued with meaning. They also have to be enacted to have meaning. And for Black people, the enactment of them is the struggle that's ongoing. And that we'll talk about a lot, I'm sure, on and off tonight.
Right. Yeah, so let's talk about that. I'll ask another question, and we can talk about it as the assault on the consensus narrative or the freedom narrative and decentering the war. And this is a great audience, and I know you know a lot about the Civil War, so we can sort of roll up our sleeves and talk about some of the debates within the field. So we're living through a moment when the old freedom narrative, this story of steady progress from slavery to emancipation to equality, is under serious assault, and rightly so. Many historians now trace how the brutal logics of slavery persisted through the war and after it, shaping Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and even U.S. imperial expansion into the West. Has that critique in some ways decentered the Civil War itself, made it feel less like a rupture and more like a chapter in the longer history of racial domination and state violence? And if so, what are the risks and rewards of that shift?
I would argue that this critique of the freedom narrative has dangers within it in its diminution of the Civil War's importance, because the right not to have your child sold is a rupture, a very positive rupture in a pattern of enslavement that has existed for centuries. And to overturn that, even though there's so much backsliding on what freedom and the franchise and civil rights of the 19th century version seem to offer. And as you were asking that question, Jim, I sat here and I thought to myself, are we going to think about the civil rights movement this way in 100 years and say, it wasn't really a rupture, it didn't really change things because there's all this backsliding that we're now experiencing. I mean, the Voting Rights Act is disappearing. So I think that my view of the world, having grown up as the civil rights movement was unfolding, was that progress ought to always be like this and would always be like that. And now looking back at the to and fro and back and forth, it's always a struggle.
It's always a struggle.
And there's steps, but there's always a struggle. And we see it again. This is not a narrative where the 20th century to the 21st century has just meant expanding freedom without any reversals. So I think we have to recognize and reinforce the times there is forward progress and not deny that it's progress. Because if you deny it's progress, you're going to lose all hope. Why bother?
Right.
There were big reasons to bother. There were big reasons that all those people died. They didn't die in vain because someone's child wasn't sold because of that. And for whatever else got lost along the way and what didn't turn out to be a permanent gain, at least there was a foothold and at least it was the basis for further struggle.
Right.
I think from the first day I started teaching, which was as a high school teacher, way back when, I won't give you the day. I think, consciously or not, I think I was trying to teach against progress, or against the theory of progress. Somehow, and that was part of that time and place, but somehow if history is all progress, which Americans love, and I do too, who doesn't want to believe in it? Who doesn't want your fifth grader to believe there's progress? Or your 10th grader. But I think in the sense that we represent what history is by teaching, I've always felt like there's a need to, that's the grain against which we need to teach. I'd say one other thing. This freedom narrative, as we're calling it, or the freedom consensus, or from slavery to emancipation, Reconstruction, the Great Amendments and beyond, part of the reaction to that was the reaction to teaching about the nation at all. We all know, and we've been part of it, you've really been part of it, social history sort of won the day in the writing and research and teaching of American history, not without good reason. I mean, historians found ways methods to do social history, the history of aggregates, the history of communities, the history of ordinary people, and so on. Social history, by its very nature, had us wondering about all events, big turning point events. Well, maybe they weren't as big as we thought if we're looking at ordinary folk, if we're looking at the ground, and so on. And, some of us have dabbled in social history, some of us built our careers on it, but sometimes the big events did get lost in that. I remember the famous essay by Maris Vanafskis way back in whatever it was, 1989, said, the title was, "Have Social Historians Lost the Civil War?" And by that he meant, we're doing so much social history of ordinary folk and so on that we're forgetting that these big events ever happened. And he had good evidence of that. Civil War is a massive rupture in American history. Nothing's the same afterward. And this set of ideas that crept into our popular culture as well as, to some extent, scholarly culture, this idea that somehow nothing ever really changed, especially about racism, especially about race relations and so on. No. That was a hell of a rupture. And otherwise, there wouldn't have been 3 constitutional amendments. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been 700,000 dead. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a whole new culture of death, a whole new culture of mourning that people had to face. So it can be both. It can be both, that sometimes we get carried away with the freedom narrative, the consensus narrative. Jim McPherson isn't here tonight, so we can say whatever we want about that. I love Jim. But it is both a gigantic, it's the most divisive set of events in American history. And sometimes maybe we overplayed the continuity of end of slavery, solving slavery. We all became abolitionists. No, we didn't. Have you looked around recently? Anyway.
Well, this might be the moment of minimum tension here.
Oh,
because
good. All right.
I have to say that while I absolutely end up in the same position as my friends to the right over here.
I attacked social history there, sorry.
That was just for fun. I have to say that the continuity argument, or in its scholarly terms, the emphasis on the afterlives of slavery and what it means and how it continues to live on, and the violence of slavery being reenacted and reproduced in generations after emancipation. That argument is potent because of its resonance in contemporary American life. And I can tell you from teaching undergraduates, but especially young graduate students right now, that they are incredibly susceptible to this argument, and it has to do with a pessimism about the present.
Yeah.
Okay, and so as a public-facing argument, whether you're Ta-Nehisi Coates or Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, if you're trying to explain something about the contemporary world and you're pointing to the past and making this argument, more power to you. But as a historian, so from a historical, and I would say also in a substantive way, from a historical point of view, it has introduced a methodological challenge that I think is merited and has to be considered, which is the asymmetry of the archives, the silence of the archives around the brutality of slavery, and the continued brutality, say, in Reconstruction. There's not silence around it, but it can be steamrolled through. And what those scholars like Saidiya Hartman, who in the most extreme case says emancipation is a non-event. Okay, so that's an extreme form of the argument. She's a literary critic. It's an extreme form of the argument that I think very few historians could go that far. But whether, in fact, we've been forced to think about what we know from the archives and what we not only don't know, but maybe can't know from the archives, I think there's been really important interventions made from that position of forcing us to recognize this through line of violence, especially racial violence. And especially about intimate violence and the sexual violence of slavery that did bear on who owned whose children and so forth. And so I think here of like Christina Sharp's book, Monstrous Intimacies, or Frederick Douglass's line that every kitchen is a brothel under slavery. Does that all just end? Absolutely not. But what does end, as Drew said, is slavery itself, the financialization of reproduction, the financial incentive for rape. These things end. The ownership of other people's children, that ends. So in that sense, the Civil War and emancipation is a profound rupture with the past. And how could it not be? It destroyed a social system that had existed for more than 2 centuries, an entire social system. Slavery is not just one thing. It is a way of organizing life. And so the undoing of it, the destruction of it, was a massive undertaking, and that was the project of the war, but also especially of Reconstruction. What's the 13th Amendment if you don't enforce it? Who enforces it on every plantation, in every farm, in every household? A household of 200 people has to be dismantled and made into nuclear families? This is an unbelievable rupture. But the sexual violence of slavery is like an explosive charge under the whole thing, the whole negotiation over freedom. So while I think that in its extreme form, emancipation is a non-event, that's just something a historian can't think like that. But we've learned things in this debate. I'm forced to take them more seriously by my students who are skeptical of the freedom narrative and think it's a get out of jail free card for the postbellum period. But at the same time, I think to recognize that the violence of slavery it doesn't undermine the revolutionary nature of what emancipation accomplished, but it does make us think differently about the struggle that ensued with emancipation. And I think that is the version of it that I could carry forward, not the non-event part. I actually think if we think about the sexual violence of slavery, that rupture is all the more fundamental. The criminalization of rape of black women, for example, a customary right that these, what Du Bois called petty kinglets, the little kinglets, planters, had exercised for centuries. All of a sudden, they're ordinary men. They have to, they don't concede all their noblesse oblige in one go. They have to be made to do it. So that struggle goes on, and in that sense, I end up in the exact same place as what Drew said, is that there is no knockout hits in history. You just keep fighting and moving forward. Yeah. And it's the struggle continues. So yes, of course there are elements of continuity. And in terms of, say, sexual violence, yes, we should know more about that. But does it undermine the idea that this is a revolutionary transformation of the United States and the destruction of a slaveholding way of life? Absolutely not. This is a revolutionary rupture for sure.
So on some level, I'm thinking about this, and I guess this is more of a comment than maybe a question, but it seems like some of the tension, Stephanie, in the way that you laid it out really elegantly, is the distinction between maybe public-facing scholarship and this idea that people like Ta-Nehisi Coates or even Nicole Hannah-Jones, among others, are sort of turning to this idea that the Civil War wasn't necessarily a disruption in order to emphasize these brutalities later. Academic historians might be more careful to make that claim. So I'm wondering if you all think about the Civil War in terms of what it means in an academic way, and both in terms of your scholarship, in terms of your teaching, and then how does the knowledge of the Civil War play out even today in public debate and so forth? Go ahead.
So file that away, that question that you just asked, because the one, and I'm not contesting or trying to introduce more tension in everything you all are saying about
it's
the
a
rupture.
roundtable.
But
Especially like that.
Especially what you were saying, Stephanie, makes me think because it is this just massive disruption, all the things that you've talked about and you've described so eloquently in your book, in The Republic of Suffering, and it's just, I think it's unimaginable for us today what kind of rupture it was. And yet white supremacy resists that.
Yeah.
So if your starting point is looking at the persistence of white supremacy and its ability to adapt and morph, and I'm not talking about like KKK white supremacy, but just white supremacy as in a country that at least through the civil rights movement, arguably well past into today, was built and maintained primarily for the advantage of one group of people, the majority group of people, first and foremost, that it is able, you have this incredible disruption, and yet it persists. And it's really healthy before, during, and after. So because it is both, right? It doesn't have to be either or, but so how does the persistence of white supremacy mesh with the incredible disruption of the Civil War? If that question makes sense.
Well, I think that this is one of the things that gives it so much power, is you can't challenge what you're saying. It's absolutely true. But the question, the devil's in the details, I think, because white supremacy itself has to be reconstructed on new terms.
Okay.
Slavery is the basis of it. It answers all the questions while it's in place. It's dismantled. And then there's this period of, kind of ideological confusion and political confusion as this class tries to reconstitute itself and reassert social and political power, but in an entirely new system. And so the reconstruction of white supremacy is part of the subject of reconstruction. And ideologically, politically, violence obviously is a huge part of this. What I think is inherent in the continuity argument that I didn't mention before, that I find very difficult to understand the embrace of this argument, is the second slavery argument. It's just a new kind of slavery. This is the one that makes me sort of can't breathe type question, is like how to explain the depth of my resistance to that idea. And part of the resistance is the people who fought and died for emancipation, not to embrace the heroic. I'm talking about ordinary black men and women on plantations who were just surviving the war while resisting the Confederacy. Right. They're still, the ones who survive this, they live on and they fight harder than anybody else for what this means.
Right.
They're the ones who are invested in this, who are keeping it alive. And so I think and also I know it's incredibly, draws a lot of fire to say this, right. But I think the changes that come in this period, they change the United States permanently. It's not like abolition democracy wins and all of its version is enacted, but the terrain is new, and the terrain of struggle is new. And in fact, I don't really understand history in any other way except as an ongoing terrain of struggle. And this is one moment when it seems more open. I mean, I grew up in Northern Ireland, in a place where the sort of military occupation and this sense of, Northern Irish people went on the streets to organize for one man, one vote, and got mowed down. And then they took to violence, right? So the sense that history opens up at certain moments and that certain things are possible, I'm incredibly sensitive to that. And this is one of those moments. And I think Black Americans, in the South especially, but their allies in the North too, are pressing to make this stick and make this have meaning and substance, and all of those things, including the constitutional amendments. The Supreme Court guts them.
Yeah.
Hello, but they're actually some of that is enacted in everyday life and in political life. In 1867, under military occupation, a year before the 15th Amendment, black men are registered to vote in the South.
Can we pick up on your mowed down metaphor? Because the other side of this is that the masses of white Southerners who've survived this war and have really lost believe they were mowed down.
Yeah.
They believe their civilization was obliterated from under them unfairly, wrongly, et cetera, et cetera. They have a degree of hatred that has to find a place, has to find a path somehow. They cannot abide or even imagine the idea of racial equality, which is being, now I'm not making the anti-Reconstruction argument here at all. But what happens here, of course, is that the resistance to the triumph of emancipation, the resistance to the victory, to the verdict of Appomattox is enormous if it's allowed to thrive. And it wasn't at first, but it didn't take long. I mean, you guys know all this. And we've both written about memory and it's the ways it affects people. Eventually, this becomes a struggle to define and redefine what the war had been, what the war had been about. And it becomes a colossal battle over narrative, stories. Who's going to run, who's going to control this story? And the course of the rest of the 19th century is not just that the South won the peace. That doesn't get you anywhere. There's a whole culture that develops of putting the Union back together, of reconciling North and South, of reconciling black and white, although there weren't enough people working to do that, even if they could, before the turn of the 20th century. So it's a war that left, any war of this, it's the rarest of things where the side that loses a really big war doesn't find itself a lost cause. It happened with the French after the Franco-Prussian War, it happened to the Germans after the First World War, and it really happened to the white American South after our Civil War. And lost causes can become enormously potent cultures if allowed to thrive. Now, the only potential lost cause, and maybe there were two of them, in Germany and Japan in the wake of World War II. I mean, there certainly were lost causes there, but they were not allowed to thrive because of the Cold War, as much as they might have. But this continuity or now continuity, this freedom narrative that we're calling it, is going to crash into a society and a culture that cannot reconcile, cannot solve what that war was really about, and it starts believing narratives that are just flat out false. It's the risk, in part, that we're taking now in all of our culture of disinformation. I mean, what's a fact anymore? You could ask that in 1890 about arguments about the Civil War. What was a fact? Was there any truth here? And that's another problem. Historians got afraid of words like truth until about 2016.
I just want to say about your point, Scott, I think it's a really important one because, as Stephanie said, what are the conditions in which this ideology of white supremacy thrives, lives, perpetuates itself? And I think the conditions changed dramatically and it got put on its back foot. And when we're telling these stories about the past, it's so important that we recognize those nuances and those opportunities. And to tell the second slavery story is to erase so much of what was going on in terms of the building of black institutions, churches, the growth of black land ownership, even in small places, even when it was threatened, the emergence of the NAACP in the early 20th century. There are just so many things that begin to be possible, even against tremendous odds, and so many things don't become possible, but nevertheless some do. And so you have to ask, on what ground does it stand, and how does that ground shift? The disruption after the Civil War, the South was poor. Suddenly the richest part of the nation was the poorest part of the nation. You know, things were overturned and white supremacy had to reestablish itself. But the study and the story of that shifting of the footage or the shifting of the foothold of white supremacy, I think is a really important story, and it's not one that we can minimize or
I
forget.
mean, they're temporarily on the defensive, temporarily.
Yeah,
And
for
then-
about 5 or 10 years.
I mean, under Johnson, they're emboldened, and they're really allowed to get up ahead of steam.
Yeah.
And then they're put back under the South's put back under military occupation, and they're knocked down, and in some ways out of the political system temporarily. Doesn't take them long to figure it out. And there's a kind of, I think of it as a kind of campaign of vengeance. And as I forget the guy's name who wrote a recent book, talked about vengeance. I heard it on a podcast, so I can't remember who it was. But he talked about vengeance as having its own moral force. And that really stayed with me, because these guys really think a crime was done to them. Military occupation is a crime. Imposing black suffrage under military occupation is a crime. Well, that's a tricky one. Because can you create democracy under conditions of military occupation? Are we sorry they did that? No. Is this the way to go about it? Not usually. So I mean, these are extremely straitened times, and they turn this. There's this German guy, Schivelbusch, who wrote this book called Cultures of Defeat. The book's terrible, but the introduction's amazing. And he talked about the loser's myths. You know, the lost cause, the respectful term, but the rest of the time he talks about losers' myths. And losers' myths are powerful. And they go after people, and they go after black soldiers. It's a post-war moment too. There's after civil wars especially, there's always this settling the debts. And black soldiers were the enemy within during the war, or black people. And then, black soldiers and their families are targeted by the Klan and other places. So there's no question that there's this violent. I mean, this is why people like Kadada Williams now talk not about the defeat or failure of Reconstruction, but the overthrow of it. It's a violent overthrow.
It was defeated.
It was defeated. I really can't stand hearing any more about the failure of Reconstruction. Like, look at what we're capable of. Not a fraction of what was accomplished then, under much more difficult circumstances. So, this is all.
Could I throw up a
Causes
question,
of-
Jim? Just
Go ahead.
Scott, I mean, all of us who teach. This reaction we get from students now, that terrible impatience, which is understandable, when race relations blow up again, as they did in 2020. 2020 was a real turning point. Somebody's got to be writing a great book on 2020 right now. Are you? Somebody? And young people, they've been taught that the civil rights movement was a victory, an incredible victory, from Rosa Parks right through the Voting Rights Act. And lo and behold, that's not working so well. And they're growing up when elections don't, if they care about things like this, don't encourage them a lot. And so they're not patient with this long view of history. They're not patient with our questions about continuity and change. They want to know why this didn't change back then.
Yeah.
Enough already of telling us to hang in there or wait, and history has its cycles and all. Now, we know that we have to tell them that. We're not being honest. But how many times have we all sat in an office with a student or in a classroom and just tried to help them take a long view when they're 20 years old? And so that will eternally be the problem, especially with questions of race in the United States. They don't want to wait.
But I think right now that I see something with students right now that's really, took me a while to figure this out, very, very, very smart, especially graduate students, is they're a really strange, my own kids too, I think, they're a really strange combination of skeptical and idealistic. They think they want the completest version of equality, and they want it now. And why didn't they get it right the first time or the second time?
Why
or the
didn't
third
we
time?
get it right, our
They're
generation?
incredibly
and all that?
idealistic. They think it can happen. Just get the right people in there. It can happen. And they're incredibly skeptical about the past, because it was all rolled back by their lights. It never delivered the full package. And I find this incredibly endearing, this idealism, and the indignity, the indignation even when it's directed at us.
You never want to slap them?
So much, no, there's
I
so much energy in it.
I mean, David, and this relates to what you're saying too, Stephanie. It's not you tell them wait, it's you tell them struggle.
Yeah.
It's not delivered to you.
Yeah,
You've
no,
got to go get
yeah,
it. You
exactly.
Know?
Yeah.
But
Yeah, there's no waiting.
Yeah, get out there and work for it.
Get involved, yeah.
let me just try to put a
Run for
finer
office.
point on the freedom narrative point, because I think maybe we could talk about it in a different way. And so I think that there's a way in which we could talk about it as scholars, but there's also a way that people talked about it in the 19th century. And I think that some of the pushback is the way that people talked about it in the 19th century, which was the fact that this was this new birth of freedom. But what happens to the army after the Civil War? And when Drew mentions this point on what ground did the freedom narrative sit, I think it's really important to think about the West in this way. And I think we might not have the answers here, and I think that's okay. And I think that this shows why there's a necessity to do more scholarship, and we will have more studies in the future, and there's already an emerging historiography on this. But as the Union Army is leaving the South and this whole idea of freedom opens up, they are then able to use the Army, the bureaucracy of the Army, the military power of the Army, to move in the West, and then to justify imperial expansion, and to then lead to the dispossession of Native American people. And so I think that's where I see some of the tension. And my students and I discovered this when we were reading books in my Civil War capstone class this past fall, is that when you actually get on the ground, you see the same people fighting for freedom using the apparatus of the military to lead to the dispossession of Native people. So I think that that tension is important, and I don't necessarily think that we need to maybe frame it as a disruption, but to actually think about it in terms of what's happening on the ground there. So I wanted to say that because I felt that there might have been a way that the question wasn't clear. All right, another question. All right. So in many classrooms, this is the divide between the Civil War and Reconstruction. In many classrooms, we tend to teach the Civil War and Reconstruction together as part of a continuous story of conflict, emancipation, and transformation. Yet within the field, those two eras often feel sharply divided. Reconstruction has drawn renewed energy, especially through the remarkable body of work on Black life, race and citizenship, but it can sometimes seem, perhaps a bit cynically, that as studies of Reconstruction and Black freedom flourished, some Civil War historians responded by cordoning off the war itself, focusing more on military or political history and less on the social questions that connect the two. Emancipation, which should bridge the periods, has instead emerged as a kind of a border. How do you see that divide? Why do you think these silos persist? And what do they reveal about the politics and pressures shaping the field today?
Go ahead.
Oh dear. Well, I've never taught them separately.
Sure.
I've had mentors who made sure I didn't. I'm not sure about when I was a high school teacher, because you're making it up every day when you go in there. Anyway, I mean, my goodness, from day one, I've always taught it as there's a continuity for you. I mean, there's a whole section in my course called Wartime Reconstruction. I mean, all the Reconstruction plans and schemes, most of the basic ideas about Reconstruction were already debated during the war years. The word was used all the time. If the North wins, what would Reconstruction look like? Now, Reconstruction draws now enormous energy and interest, even in public history, even in public history, and among teachers. I do a lot of work in the summer with teachers. I do one institute here now at Gettysburg College. And teachers want to teach more Reconstruction because they've discovered, if nothing else, that it's all over our politics and our constitutional structure, our system. Something like 2/3 of all litigation in any courtroom is 14th Amendment litigation. Federalism, one of the most basic threads of the Constitution, got really reimagined, but then settled back into old ways during Reconstruction. Whenever we talk about rights, black rights or anybody else's rights, the reimagining of rights, we're talking about Reconstruction. Almost all of the basic questions of Reconstruction are still with us. They are, nearly every day. Voting rights? There's one that young people could be really angry about. That all got changed. And I certainly grew up thinking, yeah, okay, at least with the vote. No, they're rolling back the Voting Rights Act as we speak. And the Supreme Court will do it in the next term. So there's an awareness, finally. And our current politics, again, I'm sorry to keep coming back to that. No, I'm not. Because it does draw us back to parts of the past that are so relevant to right now. Impeachment. I mean, every time we have to face an impeachment, we end up learning something more about Andrew Johnson's impeachment. Many other issues. The scholarship on Reconstruction is still just booming, and for good reason. It doesn't lend itself to some of the old ideas of progress and anti-progress and all of that. And I agree with you that the term failure just doesn't, it's not as useful as we might have once thought. There were failures in Reconstruction, but there's failures in everything. I once did an exercise with my own graduate students. I had about 5 of them who had either just finished or were about to finish or whatever, and they'd all done dissertations that had something to do with post-Civil War America and Reconstruction. So I asked them all to tell me when they thought Reconstruction ended. Of course, they all had an answer that was directly related to their dissertation. One said, oh, it's all over in the slaughterhouse case in 1873. There's nothing left of it after that. Oh, come on, you know. Another said it's 1883 with U.S. v. Stanley. Another said, no, it's the election of Woodrow Wilson in 1912, the first Southern-born president, and he brings all the segregation to Washington. Another who's a great, Steve Prince, is a great cultural historian. He wouldn't choose a date. He wanted to talk about big ideas and forces and cultural trends in the 1880s. You know, so that's one of those perpetual, forever debates. Reconstruction has not ended. And it may never end. If this Constitution survives, Reconstruction never ends.
That sounds Lincolnian.
That sounds Lincolnian? Mm-hmm. Well, I'll take that. Thank you, my friend. Anyway, and I think the public is now getting that, whereas it didn't before. Reconstruction was that hole in most people's education for years. We learned a lot about, what did Kenneth Stamp once say? In one of his books, he said, there's plenty of glory to go around in the war years, and then came Reconstruction. It's like, well, why bother? There's no glory in Reconstruction. Why would you want to learn about that?
Jim, I want to ask, you framed this as kind of chronologically that now we want to put them back together and they used to be separated, or when are they separated, when are they not? And I wonder if part of whether you think of them as a unit or separate them out is a little bit dependent on the methods of history, and that if you're looking at military history, you're going to focus on the Civil War more than you're going to focus on Reconstruction. If you're looking at Reconstruction as simply a political force, which I think is how it was framed when I was coming up as a graduate student, then it has a different valence and a different relationship. But with the explosion of social history and the deep immersion in the experience of the freed people and the Freedmen's Bureau and the whole narrative of that experience, that puts it together in a way that you can't separate the two. One begins, Reconstruction begins in 1861. So is it in part I mean, I know it's other things as well, but the particular angle of method that you're taking, doesn't that have an effect on the way the
Yeah.
two are related?
Right. I think that there's a backlash against the Freedmen's Bureau as the bridge between the Civil War and Reconstruction, and so that it seems that
That's a seamless kind
right
of,
and so I think that Civil War historians have cordoned off military history as separate from emancipation, which in my mind you can't disentangle those because of the fact that the Freedmen's Bureau is part of, I hate to say it, but the War Department, which was the War Department at the time.
But when you thought of military history as generals and battles.
Logistics and tactics. And that there's almost this way of creating this, the Civil War almost becomes more lily white in this way because it disentangles and depopulates emancipation from it, and it becomes a story that reifies tactics and strategy, and we know that really one of the biggest things about military history is logistics, and yet that seems to almost get pushed aside. And so what we're seeing again is stories, political biographies, military biographies, and all of which I think there's an effort to do that kind of recovery work that's useful, but it almost then makes Reconstruction and especially emancipation as two separate periods, and then it becomes political, so that Reconstruction becomes reduced as woke history, and Civil War history becomes reduced as like, that's the real thing that happened. And so that's where the question came from, and I see it even within meetings of like the Society of Civil War Historians, where the emphasis is like, well, and I'll be personal, I'll be autobiographical. This feels like Dr. Phil or the Oprah stage. I'm a Reconstruction historian trained by Eric Foner. They're like, yeah, but you're not really a Civil War historian. And in my mind, I was like, well, I don't even know what that means. But you know, to be a Civil War historian was to be trained in a certain kind of military history.
I just wonder, I want to let Stephanie speak, but if we think about other wars in other places and other times, war and aftermath, there they are as a piece. And what do we learn about our own divisions that we're imposing here by looking at a comparison with how other wars are looked at? And does that help clarify any of these kind of accusations or divisions?
That's another very, very peculiar American thing, which is that we think of Reconstruction with a capital R, as if this is a singular case of a post-war society that had to reconstruct itself. That is ridiculous. Every war has a post-war, and all of them involved a process of reconstruction. After civil wars, it's different. It has elements that are different than international wars. But we could learn a lot from other post-war moments, and we just don't want to. Because, and in that way, it is tied to the Civil War. It's our national struggle. That's the only story, you know, that can be kind of bankrolled, I think, to be taught. But I'm like really intrigued by your analysis, Jim, and part of the reason is because I've always found you such a inclusive, your own leadership in the field and in programming in the field has been so much about breaking down those kinds of boundaries. And I have to say, you know, we're having a conversation about public-facing history, but also about the academy. And I don't know exactly what new energy there is in Civil War history now. The anti-heroic narrative, that the war was that the war was a humanitarian crisis, right? Which your work is a huge part of. Those were critical developments in the field, but I don't know exactly what's going on now like that. And I have always found Civil War history a difficult field to enter. I mean, there's far more gatekeeping in that area, in that field, than I think in many other fields. Particularly from my point of view by military historians. And I took a shot at expressing the limitations of that gatekeeping in the book I wrote in 2019, where I tried to write about, that there is no gap between the social history of the war and the military history of the war. In the case of the Confederacy, for example, where 40% of adult men are enslaved and unavailable for military service. So the military history of the Confederacy means that 80% of white men are forced to serve, starting at 18 to 35 and ending up 15 to 55. Not many people are alive past 55 at this point. So don't try to tell me that that social history of slavery doesn't have is not relevant to military history. That's just ridiculous and also extremely frustrating.
Right.
And yet, you will be told, at any point you introduce that, you will be told that's not military history.
Right.
Just like political history, there's certain things that count and certain things that don't. And I think the gatekeeping has been very detrimental to the field.
Yeah.
And I agree with David that the Reconstruction has just cracked open. Again, like it was on lockdown, I think, for 30 years. You know, the phoner synthesis held. I think it's crashed, it's broken. It doesn't hold up anymore for the reasons we already discussed, the continuity idea, the sort of the idea that it's an unfinished revolution that's going to be finished in the next civil rights round. No, it's not only the 22-year-olds who don't believe that anymore. But yeah, I think that this is a really, has always been an unfortunate element of the professionalization of the field.
Right.
Well, just for the sake of argument, social history found the Civil War, without a doubt. We had book after book after book, 20 and 30 years ago, on the common soldier. Now, there'd been real earlier work on common soldiers, but man, did we figure out how to finally read those thousands of letters and diaries and understand the values of young men in the 19th century. That was social and cultural history finding military history. Military history became about women. You both have written on that. I've taught in...
Not really, though.
Well, in my Civil War course, I teach your book on the Confederacy, and I teach Drew's book, Mothers of Invention. This is wartime. This is what war does to people, real people, ordinary people. And in the case of Drew's book, I mean, who never stopped writing diaries and narratives and letters. And you do the same thing in Confederate Reckoning in many ways. You're trying to show this war affects everybody, every day. They're hungry. They can't move. They have no mobility. They're experiencing loss in ways they've never encountered. That's still, well, there are military historians who won't call it military history because it's not about campaigns. And they will keep their gates. I know some who will keep their gates on that. But military history got redefined, if you're willing to redefine it.
I wonder.
It's war and society. It's war as experience.
I wonder if, as a relative newcomer to the Civil War history field.
The gate's open. Gate's wide open, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't run into this stuff, that you all have dealt with for decades. But I am wondering for the military historians, that actual, the kind of hard military history is what, as a kid, drew me into history when I was living in West Germany as an Army brat. And as we know, the interest in history is declining, interest in Civil War history is declining. But a lot of what brings the almost 1 million people a year to Gettysburg is, the 3 days of battle.
Sure.
So I wonder if there's ways that...
That's why I first came here.
So I wonder if there's ways we need to think about how to sell all the work that you have done or market to the military historians. Maybe sell's a bad word, but to the military historians, as in this actually makes the stuff that they're so interested in and why some people come for those 3 days, it makes it more interesting, right? It makes it more interesting to know, like the stuff you've talked about, Stephanie, about these Confederate soldiers, the Union soldiers, and how the Union is thinking about, like your chapter on the black soldier's wife. So soldiers, when they're in the field, they're thinking about their family, right? They're thinking about their wives and their daughters and their sons. And they understand that this isn't just, maybe the minute they're getting shot at, all they're thinking about is survival. But those are, such a sliver of the moment of their service, right? And in the military. So what are they thinking about the rest of the time? So those lives are impacting their lives. So anyway, I'm just wondering if there's a way we academic historians need to think about how do we work in synergy with the folks who have been keeping the gates on military history.
Well, go ahead.
Well, one of the ways we tried, and would like to try again, is with the National Park Service. I mean, there was a period where the Organization of American Historians had a long-term agreement with the National Park Service. This goes back 20 and 30 years. And teams of 3 would be sent out to battlefields to historians. I did one at Kennesaw Mountain, I did one here at Gettysburg, and I did one somewhere else. We would examine all the exhibitions, we would examine their orientation film and so on and so forth, and try to make careful recommendations how to get, particularly the history of slavery, into the Civil War sites. For example, at Kennesaw Mountain, by the time Sherman's army gets to Kennesaw Mountain and beyond to the battle for Atlanta, I forget the total numbers now, how many thousand freed
People are following the army.
Yeah, oh God, by the thousands.
You can't shake them.
And now we have good deep studies of that.
Yeah.
Now, that worked for quite a while, and we would produce all these reports and so on and so forth. But I'll never forget the guy at Kennesaw Mountain. He'd been a lifetime, God bless him, lovely guy. He'd been in the Park Service all his life. And he saw us as kind of the uninvited enemy. He said, just want you 3 to know, I'm a black powder man, which means he did guns and cannon. And we said, okay, great. You need that here. It's good, it's great. But maybe think a little bit, no. So they had an issue in the Park Service. A lot of their people had never been trained in any of this history. They hadn't read this. A lot of that changed over the years. We used to run seminars at Harper's Ferry for Park Service people, employees from all over the country. So, and now the Park Service is under such duress and their budgets are so cut that agreement between traditional historians and the Park Service has fallen apart. But that will always be the challenge.
And I think one of the ways to deal with that challenge, and we can move on, is about building relationships.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, the Park Service folks here, I don't know if Chris Quinn's out there anywhere, or the other, or John Hoptack, but the folks here at Gettysburg, like, they want to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and they've done a great job.
And when it happens, it's usually because it's about building personal relationships between us and them that can enable that.
I remember when I saw the new orientation film at the Gettysburg, the new center, I thought, my God, this is good.
So I'm aware of the time, and I just want to maybe let Drew possibly have the last word.
Me?
I know I'm putting her on the spot, but I know you can handle it because,
Okay.
You can do this. David said social history founded the Civil War, but Drew's article, which I'm sure you've read, the landmark article published in Civil War History, We Should Grow Too Fond of It, Why We Love the Civil War. You show...
I teach in every course.
Right, but you show how the Civil War actually helped to create the fields of social history, women's history, black history, and all of this. And so, just in general, just thinking about that article and thinking about Civil War history today, why do we all love the Civil War so much? And why do you love the Civil War so much? As maybe a final comment.
Ooh, that gives me a lot of free reign. You might be here all night listening to the answer to that. You began the list of questions you sent us with a question about how was the Civil War taught when you began your career? And I'm the oldest person on this stage. I'm not that much older than David, but a little bit. And when I began teaching, people didn't teach the Civil War unless they were military historians talking about guns and battles. And that meant there was this extraordinary, untapped opportunity for a direction that was emerging in the field of history more generally to look at the lives of ordinary people and to look at them under duress when they have to ask themselves what matters. I mean, literally life and death moments. What do you believe in? I mean, it was a war that made Lincoln deliver the Gettysburg Address and say, this is what a nation means. It's a war that makes somebody have to decide, I will risk my life because I care so much about whatever it is I'm caring about. And wars also are a time when people write letters to each other. At least this war was a time. There's a very literate population. They didn't have email, so we have this extraordinary documentary record of ordinary people who would not have been writing down things about their lives, and people who thought, this is what I'm doing right now is important, and so I want to record it. So it was a treasure trove, and as this trend or this desire to understand the common person in American life gained steam, it was just the most wonderful opportunity to explore and ask fundamental questions about what does it mean to be human? What do you care about in life? What is the foundation of our nation? What is the foundation of the racial dilemmas and white supremacy and oppression? How does that play out in American life? I mean, just everything that mattered was right there waiting for us. And I think we fell in love with that opportunity as historians and the ability to forge ahead and to contribute to those questions, which were human questions, historical questions, political questions, and moral questions, all at once.
May I tell one anecdotal tale about
Yes,
Drew?
please.
I was a nobody first-year junior faculty member at Harvard, and what that meant in those years was you had a 5-year appointment. We called them folding chairs. Each year a leg would fall off. You know. But they were recruiting Drew to come to Harvard. And this room full of historians and other sort of fussy Harvard professors, she got up and put up a picture of the burial of Latin.
Did I?
Yes, you did. A painting, a famous, important painting that is such a lost cause document. And then you analyze the painting on your way to discussing, you know, I don't remember what the big theme of the lecture was, but I remember, and I thought, whoa, she's showing a painting in a job talk, or what I guess became a job talk. It's like the late 80s, and, you know, people didn't do that.
That painting, you wrote about that in Creation of Confederate National.
I did?
Yes,
That must have been when it
goes back
was.
to that book.
It was
Yeah.
processing that book that
Yeah.
made me write Confederate Reckoning.
Whoa.
Because you made the cultural and ideological argument, which I was persuaded by, but the whole time I'm reading it, I'm thinking, I'm the materialist. This is not just about ideas. This is about people's lived experience, you know, the social historian in me.
Yeah.
Because the other thing I would add about, you know, as historians, why do we love our Civil War, is there's the private record, the record of private life, but if you write about illiterate people, and if you're interested in enslaved people, you're talking about, at that time, forcibly, it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write. But one thing you have to say about the US military in this moment is they kept good records.
Oh, nobody keeps records like armies.
And there's a reason that there used to be war and society courses in all history departments, because what we really want is those back. The war and society courses, because those things go together. The wars provoke these transformations. They roil everything. They throw it all up for grabs. And it's not just that it's private people are talking about, you know, they're separated. They're expressing their love. They're expressing their fear. But at the same time, the military is recording all this information about people we would otherwise know nothing about. Nothing. And so what the essay Scott's referring to is, you know, I was reading the military records for this, of the, various kinds of military records for the Civil War, and asking myself the whole time where the narrative of the black soldier came from. Emancipation is really all about the black soldier. Well, of course, this is the case. The only thing that matters to the military is soldiers, and so. But women, black women, who are equally committed to the Emancipation Project are showing up in these records, but they're showing up in these records as a problem because they keep coming. Nobody's inviting them, but they're following armies. They're showing up at army camps. They won't leave. They're just taking they're literally trying to cluster in spaces of temporary freedom behind a Union column, or at the edge on the outside of the fence of a military camp, to get their husbands' wages and feed the children. So there's a whole world around that the military almost inadvertently records, and then it's still there for us to go in and ask questions that they didn't, about, anyway, whatever. So we're all, I guess what I'm trying to say is we're all military historians in that sense, because we all are devoted to those records.
And I had the great pleasure at dinner to sit with several students at the president's house, Bob. And on my right, I do not remember her name, and I assume she's here. She said she worked this summer in the National Archives. Lucky you, wow, what a summer to be at the National Archives. She was watching people lose their jobs and on and on and on. But
documents get put away.
But 6 and 7 stories deep in the National Archives were and are these enormous records that became the Freedmen's volumes.
Yeah, Freedmen's
the great, possibly the greatest social history project anybody's ever done. Yeah. This is the documentary history of emancipation in 7, 8, 9 published volumes now. I don't know when that will ever end, if it ever ends. But it's millions of documents about emancipation. And it's the most documented emancipation of slaves in history because it happened in wartime. Mm-hmm. Right. That's military history.
Well, all right. Well, thank you very much. It's such a thrill and honor to have these wonderful historians with us tonight. Thank you.
Wow. That was fascinating. I was going to say, can you come back tomorrow and continue this? Really. I'm glad I have a couple of notes here because I'm kind of speechless right now. But on behalf of Gettysburg College, please join me in once again thanking our speakers, Professors Blight, Faust, and McCurry, as well as our moderators, Professor Downs and Hancock. I'd also like to thank Ian Isherwood, Jill Titus, and especially Triada Chavis of the Civil War Institute for all their work in organizing this event. So there will be a dessert reception right in the lobby and a book signing in the gallery right after this. So please join us for that. From the History Department here at Gettysburg College, we thank you for coming tonight. Safe travels home and best wishes to you for the Thanksgiving holiday. Good night.